Hey there, good evening. I'm really glad you're here with me tonight. Before we jump into this story, if you like what you hear, please hit that like button. It means a lot and helps me keep sharing these fascinating history tales with you. Also, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop your city and local time in the comments below. It's always nice to see how we're all connected across the world. Now get comfy, really settle in. Close your eyes if you want, but no pressure. Take a deep breath in and slowly breathe out. Let your shoulders relax, let your mind calm down, and get ready for a journey back to a time that was dark, scary, and full of secrets. Before we start, I want to give you a few little hints to keep in mind. Things that might surprise you. Not everyone accused of witchcraft was who you think they were. Some were powerful, some were innocent, and some were just unlucky. The witch hunts were about a lot more than just superstition. There were politics, greed, and fear, tangled up in ways you might not expect. Some of the most shocking stories took place in towns and villages that look peaceful today. Keep those thoughts with you as we step quietly into the shadows of medieval Europe, where the line between truth and terror was dangerously thin. As we step back into the Middle Ages, it's important to understand the world these witch hunts were born from. Europe was a very different place, full of fear, superstition, and uncertainty. People lived harsh lives, struggling with disease, famine, and war. The world was also filled with mystery. Things that science today can explain were then terrifying unknowns. In those times, the church had immense power. The Catholic Church was the dominant authority in Western Europe, shaping how people saw the world. Anything that seemed strange or different was often seen as a threat to the social and religious order. And nowhere was this more true than in the case of witchcraft. The idea of witches wasn't new. People had long believed in magic and the supernatural. But what changed in the late medieval period was the intensity and scale of fear around witchcraft. Suddenly, suspicion could lead to accusations, and accusations could lead to deadly consequences. Why? Because these accusations were rarely about magic alone. They were about control, power, and sometimes plain fear of the unknown. Let's start with how the church influenced this fear. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487 by two Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This book became a sort of manual on identifying, prosecuting, and punishing witches. It argued that witches made pacts with the devil, causing harm to their neighbors and society. The book fueled hysteria across Europe. But witch hunts were not just about religious fear. They often had deep social and political roots. Take, for example, the role of scapegoating during times of crisis. When crops failed or disease spread, communities looked for someone to blame. Sometimes it was a marginalized person, the old woman living alone on the edge of town, or a healer who used herbs and folk remedies. Sometimes it was someone with a grudge against a neighbor, using the chaos to settle scores. In addition, local politics could get tangled in these hunts. Accusations might be used to remove rivals, seize property, or silence dissent. The label witch became a weapon as much as a curse. The gender aspect is also crucial. Although not every accused witch was female, the vast majority were. Women, especially those who didn't fit the social norms, like widows, healers, or outspoken individuals, were vulnerable targets. This reflected and reinforced a deeply patriarchal society where women's power was both feared and suppressed. And the methods of persecution were brutal. Trials often involved torture to extract confessions, and punishments were severe, ranging from imprisonment to execution by burning. Innocent people confessed to impossible crimes just to end their suffering. One of the most tragic examples was the Pendle witch trials in England, 1612. 12 people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft and murder. Despite flimsy evidence and forced confessions, they were sentenced to death. Stories like this were repeated all across Europe, from Germany to France to Scotland. As we continue to explore the dark reality behind medieval witch hunts, it's essential to understand that these terrifying events were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader cultural, social, and political landscape that shaped Europe for centuries. The witch hunts stretched across countries and decades, with waves of hysteria that ebbed and flowed, but never truly disappeared until much later. One of the reasons these hunts were so widespread is that fear of witches tapped into deep anxieties present in society. People were living in precarious times. Famines, plagues, and wars were common. Life expectancy was low, and survival was a daily challenge. In such an uncertain world, having someone or something to blame for misfortune was psychologically comforting. The idea that misfortune could be caused by malevolent human forces was easier to accept than the randomness of disease or bad harvests. Witch hunts also reveal a lot about human nature, how fear, suspicion, and the need for control can escalate into cruelty. Entire communities could be swept up in a wave of paranoia, turning neighbor against neighbor, family members accusing each other, and innocent people facing horrific trials. The legal systems at the time were often ill-equipped to protect the accused. Witch trials did not operate like modern courts. The burden of proof was low, and confessions, often obtained under torture, were treated as the ultimate evidence. Torture techniques included sleep deprivation, the rack, stretching the body, and other brutal methods designed to force people to confess. Sometimes people confessed to impossible crimes just to stop the pain. Accused witches were said to have committed a variety of crimes, casting spells to harm crops or livestock, causing illness or death, flying on broomsticks to secret meetings, and even consorting with the devil. Many of these accusations came from superstitions folklore and the need to explain misfortune. It's important to highlight that not all regions in Europe experienced witch hunts equally. Some areas, like the Holy Roman Empire, roughly modern-day Germany, saw some of the most intense persecutions with thousands of executions. Other places, like England, had fewer but still notable trials. The Pendle witch trials in England in 1612 remain one of the most famous. The trial began when a 9-year-old girl named Janet Device accused her own family members of witchcraft. Under pressure, her testimony led to the execution of 12 people. The trial is a chilling example of how hysteria and personal vendettas could combine to deadly effects. In Germany, the Würzburg and Bamberg witch trials of the early 1600s saw hundreds of people executed. These trials were state-sponsored, with intense political and religious motivations. Prince-bishops used the hunts to consolidate power and root out perceived enemies. But what about the people themselves? Who were these accused witches? The stereotype of the old, ugly woman living alone is partly true, but also misleading. Accused witches came from all walks of life. Some were poor, some were wealthy. Some were respected healers, others were social outcasts. Often, women who challenged social norms or refused to conform became targets. For example, healers who used herbal medicine were sometimes accused of witchcraft because their knowledge seemed mysterious or threatening to church authorities and local doctors. These women, sometimes called cunning women, provided vital services in their communities, but were vulnerable to suspicion. Men were also accused, though in smaller numbers. Male witches were sometimes thought to be sorcerers or involved in black magic, but the majority of those persecuted were women. The connection between gender and witch hunts reflects broader social tensions. Medieval and early modern Europe was a patriarchal society where women had limited rights and were expected to be submissive. Powerful, outspoken, or independent women could easily be branded as dangerous. Religion played a huge role as well. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation periods heightened religious tensions, and both Catholic and Protestant authorities sought to root out heresy, including witchcraft. This religious fervor added fuel to the fire of witch hunts. The role of the church was complex. Some clergy pushed for harsh punishments, while others were skeptical or even opposed to the hunts. However, the popular image of the witch was often shaped by sermons and religious propaganda, which depicted witches as servants of the devil threatening Christian society. Witch hunts were also deeply political. Local rulers used the hysteria to strengthen their authority, settle scores, or confiscate property from accused witches. Wealth and land often changed hands after a witch was convicted. One striking example is the case of the Salem witch trials in colonial America, which took place much later, in 1692, but followed many of the same patterns. While not medieval Europe, Salem demonstrates how fear and suspicion can lead to mass hysteria anywhere, even in new societies. It's also important to remember the human cost of these hunts. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of people lost their lives. Families were torn apart, and communities were left scarred. What's shocking is how recent some of these events were. The last known execution for witchcraft in Europe was in the late 18th century. That's not so long ago in the grand scheme of history. Even today, accusations of witchcraft persist in some parts of the world, reminding us how deeply ingrained these fears can be. So, as we reflect on this dark chapter, it's a reminder of the dangers of fear, superstition, and unchecked power. History gives us a mirror to understand ourselves and hopefully avoid repeating such horrors. As we dig deeper into the phenomenon of medieval witch hunts, it's crucial to examine how the fear of witchcraft became woven into the very fabric of daily life. It was not just the authorities or the church fueling this hysteria. Ordinary people also lived in constant fear of their neighbors. The social atmosphere was charged with suspicion, mistrust, and a desperate need to find explanations for misfortune. Imagine living in a small village during the late Middle Ages. Life is hard. Harsh winters, unpredictable harvests, outbreaks of disease, and conflicts with neighboring communities create an environment where anxiety thrives. When a child falls ill or livestock mysteriously dies, people naturally search for a cause. Sometimes they blame fate or God's will, but often the answer they settle on is far more sinister: witchcraft. The label witch became a catch-all accusation for anything that went wrong. It could be used to explain illness, crop failure, or personal tragedy. But beyond that, it was also a tool to marginalize those who did not fit the accepted social norms: elderly women, outspoken individuals, healers, or even people simply seen as odd or different. This collective fear created a dangerous dynamic. Everyone was a potential suspect, and accusations could come from anyone: a jealous neighbor, a rival family, or even children who were coached or pressured to testify. Rumors and whispers could quickly escalate into formal charges. One of the darkest aspects of witch hunts was how they tore apart communities and families. People were forced to choose sides. Neighbors turned against neighbors, and sometimes family members testified against each other to save themselves. The social fabric was ripped apart by paranoia and suspicion. At the heart of this hysteria was a complex mix of religious doctrine, cultural beliefs, and political agendas. The church, particularly the Catholic Church, viewed witchcraft as a form of heresy, a direct challenge to God's authority. Preachers warned their congregations about the dangers of the devil's influence, often painting vivid and terrifying pictures of witches' gatherings, where the devil was said to hold ceremonies and evil deeds were performed. These sermons and teachings were powerful tools in shaping public perception. They created a narrative that witches were not just criminals, but enemies of the divine order, deserving of the harshest punishments. This religious framing gave witch hunts a moral justification that made brutality seem necessary and righteous. But political factors played an equally important role. In many regions, local rulers and authorities used witch hunts to consolidate their power and suppress dissent. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a convenient way to eliminate political opponents, seize property, or silence troublesome individuals. The chaos of the hunts provided cover for these maneuvers. For example, in the Holy Roman Empire, several of the largest witch hunts coincided with times of political instability or conflict. Princes and bishops who held both secular and religious authority used witch trials to assert control over their territories. This overlap of power made witch hunts not just a matter of superstition, but a form of governance and social control. The methods used to prosecute witches were brutal and often unjust. Trials relied heavily on confessions, which were frequently extracted through torture. Instruments like the rack, thumbscrews, and the strapado were employed to inflict pain and force admissions of guilt. Many accused confessed to fantastic and impossible crimes, simply to end their suffering, never expecting to be believed or spared. Even after a confession, the accused faced public humiliation and brutal execution. Burning at the stake was the most notorious method, symbolizing the purification of the soul through fire. In some cases, accused witches were drowned, hanged, or beheaded. It's important to remember that behind every statistic and story was a real person, someone's mother, father, sibling, or child, whose life was destroyed by fear and hatred. Yet despite this grim reality, there were voices of reason and skepticism. Some clergy, scholars, and officials doubted the validity of witch hunts and questioned the methods used. They warned against the dangers of false accusations and the moral consequences of innocent bloodshed. In time, these voices contributed to the gradual decline of witch hunts. Changes in legal standards, advances in science, and shifting religious attitudes all played a role in ending the widespread persecution. But the legacy of the witch hunts remains. They serve as a powerful cautionary tale about the consequences of fear, ignorance, and the abuse of power. They remind us to question hysteria, protect the innocent, and uphold justice. As we close this chapter, think about how fear can distort reality and how dangerous it is when societies allow suspicion to override compassion and reason. The story of the medieval witch hunts is not just a dark page in history. It's a lesson for all of us. As we journey further into the chilling reality of medieval witch hunts, it's impossible to overlook the profound psychological and cultural factors that allowed such widespread panic and brutality to take root. Fear of witches was not just a matter of superstition or religious zealotry. It was a reflection of a society struggling with change, crisis, and deep uncertainties about the world around them. One key element was the human need to make sense of chaos. When crops failed, when plagues ravaged villages, and when families were torn apart by illness or death, people desperately sought explanations. Random misfortune was frightening because it felt uncontrollable. But if misfortune had a cause, like witchcraft, it gave people a way to externalize their fear, anger, and helplessness. Blaming witches was a way to regain some sense of control, however false or tragic that control might have been. This psychological need was amplified by a cultural framework steeped in religious beliefs about good and evil, heaven and hell, and the eternal struggle between God and the devil. The church taught that the world was a battleground for these forces, and that humans could be tempted or corrupted by evil spirits. Witchcraft, therefore, was not a simple crime. It was an existential threat to the soul and society. The stereotype of the witch, as a woman who made a pact with the devil, gained supernatural powers, and attended secret, malevolent gatherings called Sabbaths, was deeply ingrained in the popular imagination. These images were often fueled by sensational stories, folklore, and the vivid descriptions in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum. Such beliefs created an atmosphere where anyone who behaved unusually or was seen as different could be suspected of being a witch. But beyond fear and superstition, the witch hunts were also a reflection of social tensions and struggles for power within communities. Marginalized individuals, often women, became scapegoats for larger societal problems. Widows without male protectors, women who practiced healing arts, or simply those who did not conform to expected behaviors were vulnerable to accusations. In many cases, witch hunts served to reinforce existing social hierarchies and control mechanisms. Patriarchal norms, religious orthodoxy, and political authorities all benefited from rooting out perceived threats to the established order. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a way to enforce conformity and punish dissent. Economics also played a part. In some regions, accusations led to the confiscation of property from the accused, benefiting neighbors or local officials. In times of scarcity or crisis, this could create incentives to accuse others and seize their assets. The role of gender cannot be overstated. Estimates suggest that between 70% to 85% of those accused and executed for witchcraft were women. This overwhelming gender imbalance reflects how deeply misogyny was woven into the fabric of these hunts. Women who were independent, outspoken, or who wielded any form of influence were seen as threats. The witch hunts became a brutal tool for controlling women's bodies, behaviors, and social roles. Men were not entirely exempt. Their numbers were far lower. When men were accused, it was often in different contexts, sometimes as sorcerers or warlocks, but frequently as accomplices or enforcers of the witch cult narrative. The legal and judicial processes involved in witch hunts were a dark testament to the miscarriage of justice. Trials were often summary and biased. The accused had little chance to defend themselves. Judges and inquisitors frequently assumed guilt rather than innocence. Evidence standards were minimal, and testimony could come from coerced confessions or the word of suspicious neighbors. Torture was widespread and legally sanctioned in many areas. The sheer physical and psychological brutality inflicted on suspects was horrific. Forced confessions were then used to justify executions and further accusations. Public executions served as grim spectacles intended to deter others, but also fueled the hysteria. Burning at the stake was the most infamous method, symbolizing the purging of evil by fire. Other methods included hanging, drowning, or beheading. Throughout Europe, the scale of the hunts varied. The Holy Roman Empire saw some of the most intense periods of persecution, with thousands executed in regions like Würzburg, Bamberg, and Trier. Scotland, France, and Switzerland also experienced major trials. England, while less severely affected overall, had notable episodes like the Pendle witch trials. The timing of the witch hunts also correlated with broader historical events. Periods of war, plague, and religious upheaval often coincided with spikes in witch persecution. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation intensified fears of heresy and devil worship, making witch hunts a tool in the religious conflicts tearing Europe apart. Despite the horror, it's important to remember that opposition to the hunts existed. Some clergy, scholars, and legal authorities began to question the evidence and morality of the witch trials. Humanist thinkers and emerging scientific approaches challenged superstitions. Gradually, legal reforms introduced more rigorous standards of evidence and protections for the accused. By the 18th century, the witch hunts largely subsided as Enlightenment ideals spread. However, the memory of these persecutions remains a stark warning about the dangers of fear, prejudice, and the abuse of power. Even today, the shadow of the witch hunts lingers. In some parts of the world, accusations of witchcraft still lead to violence and persecution. Understanding the historical witch hunts helps us recognize the human costs of fear-driven injustice and the importance of protecting human rights and reason. So as you lie there, eyes closed and mind calm, reflect on this dark chapter of history, not just as a distant story, but as a lesson about the power of fear, the need for empathy, and the dangers of letting suspicion override humanity. As we continue to unravel the tangled web of medieval witch hunts, it's essential to explore some of the most notorious cases that illustrate the scale and cruelty of this dark chapter in history. These stories provide not only shocking details, but also a clearer understanding of how fear and power combined to create devastating consequences. One of the most infamous episodes unfolded in the German territories during the early 17th century, particularly in the regions of Würzburg and Bamberg. These witch trials stand out because of their sheer scale and the direct involvement of political and religious leaders in orchestrating mass persecutions. In Würzburg, Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg, a zealous and authoritarian ruler, initiated a brutal witch hunt starting around 1626. The trials lasted for several years, resulting in the execution of hundreds of accused witches, including men, women, and even children. The pace and intensity of the hunts were staggering. Entire villages were implicated, and no one seemed safe from suspicion. The trials were often sparked by confessions extracted under torture. Once someone confessed, they were pressured to name accomplices, creating a horrifying chain reaction. This witch hunt spiral meant that communities could be decimated, with dozens or even hundreds arrested and condemned within a short time. Similarly, in Bamberg, another prince bishop, Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim, earned the nickname Hexenbrenner, or witch burner, due to his zealous persecution of witches. Between 1627 and 1632, the Bamberg witch trials claimed the lives of an estimated 300 people. What makes Bamberg particularly chilling is that members of the upper class and even nobility were not spared. Wealthy landowners and officials were accused, demonstrating how witch hunts could cut across social classes. These trials occurred during the tumultuous period of the 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict that devastated much of Central Europe. The chaos, fear, and political instability of war created the perfect storm for witch hysteria. Leaders exploited the situation to consolidate power and enforce social control. In France, the witch hunts took different shapes. While France had fewer large-scale witch trials compared to Germany, notable cases still shocked the population. The infamous Loudun possessions of the 1630s involved accusations of witchcraft against a group of nuns who claimed to be possessed by demons. The subsequent trials and executions attracted widespread attention and demonstrated how religious fanaticism and political intrigue could fuel witch hunts. Scotland, too, experienced intense persecution. Between the late 16th and early 17th centuries, hundreds of people were accused of witchcraft. Scottish witch hunts often featured public trials and executions, with a strong influence from King James VI, who had a personal obsession with witches. He even wrote a book, Demonology, which promoted the idea of witches as real and dangerous enemies. England's witch hunts, while generally smaller in scale, included the infamous Pendle witch trials of 1612. These trials resulted in the execution of 12 people, mostly women, accused of causing deaths and curses. The case was sensationalized and has since become a symbol of the tragic consequences of hysteria and injustice. What ties all these stories together is a pattern of fear, accusation, and brutal punishment, fueled by social anxieties and reinforced by religious and political power structures. It's also vital to recognize the role of folklore and superstition in sustaining these beliefs. Tales of witches flying on broomsticks, shape-shifting, casting curses, and attending secret satanic rituals captured the imagination and terrified communities. These stories, passed down and embellished over generations, created a mythology that made witchcraft seem both plausible and monstrous. Yet, behind these legends were real people, many of whom were kind, hardworking, and innocent. The cruelty inflicted upon them was a human tragedy of immense proportions. As we look at the witch hunts from a modern perspective, it's easy to judge and condemn. But it's worth remembering that those living in medieval and early modern Europe did not have the scientific knowledge or legal protections we take for granted today. Their world was shaped by fear of the unknown, religious dogma, and political turmoil. Understanding this context doesn't excuse the horrors, but helps us see how complex and deeply rooted the phenomenon was. Today, historians and scholars continue to study the witch hunts, piecing together the causes and consequences from surviving trial records, letters, and contemporary accounts. These studies reveal the dangers of mass hysteria, scapegoating, and the erosion of justice. The story of the medieval witch hunts is a cautionary tale that resonates beyond history. It warns us of what can happen when fear overrules reason, when power is abused, and when society turns against its most vulnerable. As you lie here listening, let these stories remind you of the importance of empathy, critical thinking, and standing against injustice in all its forms. As we delve even deeper into the terrifying reality of medieval witch hunts, it becomes clear that these horrific episodes were not simply the result of individual fears or isolated accusations. Instead, they were systemic phenomena woven into the very fabric of society, politics, and religion. Understanding why such widespread panic gripped Europe requires us to look at the intersection of cultural beliefs, social tensions, and power struggles. At the core of the witch hunts was a potent mixture of fear and scapegoating. Communities faced overwhelming challenges, repeated crop failures, famines, devastating plagues like the Black Death, and ongoing wars. These crises shattered the fragile stability of medieval life. People desperately sought explanations, and often found them in the form of witches, those they could blame for their misfortunes. But why witches? Why was this particular accusation so powerful? Part of the answer lies in the way medieval society conceptualized evil and misfortune. The church taught that the world was a battleground between God and the devil. Evil was personified in the figure of the devil, who was believed to have servants, witches, working actively to undermine God's creation. This religious framework made witchcraft a cosmic threat, not just a crime. The image of the witch was terrifying. According to the Malleus Maleficarum and popular folklore, witches were thought to have made a pact with the devil, trading their souls for magical powers. They were believed to fly to secret gatherings called Sabbaths, where they worshipped Satan, plotted harm against neighbors, and performed unspeakable acts. These stories captured the imagination and terrified communities, making the fear very real and palpable. This climate of fear was fertile ground for accusations. But accusations didn't arise in a vacuum. They were deeply embedded in the social dynamics of the time. Those accused were often the most vulnerable members of society: elderly women, widows without male protectors, herbalists, and midwives who practiced traditional healing, or simply people who didn't conform to social norms. Women's roles in medieval society were limited and heavily controlled by patriarchal structures. Independent women, especially those who defied expectations or wielded knowledge of healing and herbs, could be perceived as threats. The witch hunts became a brutal mechanism for policing gender and enforcing social order. However, the persecution was not solely about gender. Social tensions, economic rivalries, and personal vendettas frequently played a role. For example, if a neighbor's livestock died mysteriously or a crop failed, suspicions could quickly turn to accusations against the local healer or an outsider. Accusing someone of witchcraft was a way to explain misfortune and shift blame away from the community's own struggles. Politically, witch hunts could serve as tools for rulers and religious leaders to strengthen their control. In regions like the Holy Roman Empire, powerful bishops and princes launched mass witch hunts to assert authority, intimidate dissenters, and seize wealth. The trials became instruments of state power, cloaked in the language of religious righteousness. The judicial process during witch trials was a mockery of justice. The accused were presumed guilty, denied fair representation, and subjected to terrifying torture methods designed to force confessions. These confessions often included elaborate and implausible details of devil worship, flying, and curses, stories that prosecutors used to justify harsh sentences. Public executions of accused witches were spectacles of horror and terror, designed to reinforce social order by demonstrating the consequences of defying God and the law. Burning at the stake was the most common form of execution, intended symbolically to purify the soul through fire. It's important to note that while the witch hunts reached horrific peaks in certain regions and periods, the phenomenon was not uniform. Some countries experienced intense witch hunts. Others saw relatively few cases. Factors such as local politics, religious tensions, and legal systems influenced the extent and nature of persecutions. Despite the widespread belief in witchcraft, not everyone accepted these hunts without question. Throughout the period, there were critics, clergy, scholars, and officials who doubted the legitimacy of the accusations and opposed the use of torture. These voices helped pave the way for the eventual decline of witch hunts as Europe moved toward the Enlightenment. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the rise of scientific reasoning, legal reforms, and changing religious attitudes began to challenge the foundations of witch hunt hysteria. Trials became less frequent and skepticism grew, yet the shadow of the witch hunts lingers. The legacy of fear, misogyny, and injustice teaches us about the dangers of mass hysteria and the devastating consequences of unchecked authority. As you continue to listen and reflect, remember that these are not just stories of the distant past. They remind us of the importance of reason, compassion, and vigilance in protecting human rights and dignity. As we peel back more layers of the medieval witch hunts, the complexity and tragedy of the phenomenon become even more apparent. These hunts were not merely a product of superstition or religious fervor. They were shaped by deeply ingrained societal structures, economic pressures, and the fragile human psyche grappling with chaos. One crucial aspect to explore is the role of the legal system in facilitating the witch hunts. Unlike modern courts based on fairness and evidence, the judicial procedures of the time were often arbitrary, heavily biased, and dangerously influenced by fear. The inquisitorial system, dominant in many parts of Europe, gave judges and inquisitors broad powers to investigate and prosecute witchcraft. Accused individuals had little chance to defend themselves. The presumption of innocence, a cornerstone of modern justice, was largely absent. Instead, suspicion was enough to trigger arrest and trial. Once accused, the accused could be detained for months or years, often in dreadful conditions. The psychological strain and physical suffering in prisons were immense. Torture was used not just to punish, but to extract confessions. Techniques like the rack, strappado, and thumb screws were common, inflicting unbearable pain. Confessions obtained under torture were paradoxically taken as proof of guilt, even when the statements were fantastical or contradictory. The accused often confessed to impossible acts, flying on broomsticks, attending satanic orgies, casting deadly curses, because it was the only way to end their agony. This created a vicious cycle. Once a confession was made, authorities demanded the names of accomplices. Under threat of continued torture or death, many accused named others, sparking waves of arrests and trials. Entire communities could be engulfed in a frenzy of suspicion and denunciations. The use of spectral evidence was another disturbing aspect. This meant that testimony based on visions or dreams, where a witness claimed to see the spirit or specter of the accused committing harmful acts, was accepted in court. Such evidence was entirely subjective and unverifiable, yet it carried deadly consequences. The procedures were heavily influenced by manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, which provided a theological and legal framework for prosecuting witches. The book encouraged harsh punishments and justified torture, framing witchcraft as an existential threat to Christian society. Another layer to consider is the social profile of those accused and the victims. While the majority were women, accused witches were not a homogeneous group. They ranged from impoverished peasants to relatively well-off townswomen and even members of the local elite. Widows were particularly vulnerable. Without a husband's protection, they often became targets, especially if they managed property or engaged in business. Healers and midwives skilled in herbal remedies and traditional knowledge were often suspected of witchcraft because their practices were poorly understood and sometimes viewed with suspicion by the church and medical professionals. The intersection of gender and power is stark. In a male-dominated society where women's roles were tightly controlled, the witch hunts became a form of social control, punishing women who stepped outside accepted boundaries. At the same time, economic factors exacerbated tensions. Accusing a neighbor of witchcraft could be motivated by jealousy, greed, or a desire to acquire land and property. Some authorities used witch trials to confiscate assets from the accused, enriching themselves or their supporters. Religious upheaval also played a significant role. The Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation intensified fears about heresy and moral decay. Witch hunts were sometimes used as tools in religious conflicts, targeting those deemed enemies of the dominant faith. Despite the widespread persecution, resistance and skepticism existed. Some clergymen criticized the hunts, warning against the injustice of condemning innocent people. Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge superstitions, emphasizing reason and scientific inquiry. Eventually, legal reforms limited the use of torture and required more rigorous evidence. Witch trials became less frequent and less deadly as societies moved toward modernity. However, the echoes of the witch hunts remain relevant today. Accusations of witchcraft and related violence persist in some parts of the world, reminding us of the ongoing need for education, tolerance, and justice. Reflecting on this dark history invites us to examine how fear, prejudice, and power can combine to cause unimaginable suffering, and challenges us to build societies where reason and compassion prevail. As we press further into the grim world of medieval witch hunts, one of the most chilling truths emerges from the personal stories of those caught in the hysteria. Behind every accusation was a human being, often innocent, whose life was shattered by fear, suspicion, and cruelty. These individual stories reveal the tragic consequences of collective paranoia and the devastating effects on families and communities. Consider the story of Agnes Sampson, a Scottish woman accused during the North Berwick witch trials of 1590. Agnes was an elderly healer, respected in her community for her knowledge of herbs and midwifery. Yet when King James VI returned from Denmark and became obsessed with rooting out witches, Agnes found herself accused of causing storms to wreck the king's ship. Under torture, she confessed to attending witch gatherings and consorting with the devil. Despite the lack of real evidence, she was executed by strangulation and burning. Agnes's case illustrates how political motives intertwined with superstition. The king's personal fears and desire to assert his authority fueled the trials. Innocent people became pawns in a dangerous game of power and control. Similarly, in the German town of Trier, one of the largest and deadliest witch trials occurred between 1581 and 1593. Hundreds of people, including prominent citizens, were accused. The trials reflected intense social anxieties during a period marked by war, famine, and disease. The accused were often forced to confess under horrific torture and then implicated others, leading to a cycle of accusations that devastated entire communities. These trials show how fear of witches became a self-perpetuating force, with innocent people caught in a web of suspicion and betrayal. Families were torn apart as accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by mistrust and desperation. These trials show how fear of witches became a self-perpetuating force, with innocent people caught in a web of suspicion and betrayal. Families were torn apart as accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by mistrust and desperation. The psychological impact on those accused and their communities was profound. The terror of being accused, arrested, tortured, and publicly humiliated was unimaginable. The stigma extended beyond death, as families of the executed were often ostracized, losing social standing and economic stability. Witch hunts also reflect a broader crisis in medieval and early modern Europe, a crisis of faith, governance, and social order. The wars, plagues, and religious conflicts of the period destabilized societies. The hunts became a way to impose order amid chaos, to find enemies within, rather than face external threats. But this order was built on fear and injustice. The witch hunts reveal how scapegoating and persecution can be used to channel societal anxieties away from real problems. Instead of addressing economic hardship, political instability, or disease, Communities targeted vulnerable individuals as causes of their suffering. The role of propaganda and media of the time also contributed. Pamphlets, sermons, and trial records spread stories of witches and their supposed crimes, fueling hysteria. The Malleus Maleficarum itself was a powerful propaganda tool, reinforcing the idea of witches as a dire threat. As the centuries passed, the intellectual climate in Europe began to change. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking, emphasizing reason, empirical evidence, and skepticism. These shifts undermined the ideological foundation of witch hunts. Legal reforms gradually improved protections for the accused. Courts became more demanding of credible evidence, and the use of torture was restricted and eventually outlawed. Witch trials declined and finally disappeared in most of Europe by the late 18th century. However, the shadow of the hunts continues to teach us about the dangers of mass hysteria, prejudice, and the abuse of power. They are a stark reminder of how fear can erode justice and humanity. In today's world, accusations of witchcraft still occur in some regions, leading to violence and social exclusion. The history of medieval witch hunts underscores the need for vigilance against superstition and intolerance. As you reflect on this dark chapter, consider how societies can prevent such tragedies by fostering education, compassion, and critical thinking. Remembering the victims honors their memory and helps us build a fairer, more just future. Moving forward, it is important to understand how the cultural fabric of medieval Europe allowed witch hunts to flourish. Society at the time was marked by rigid hierarchies and deeply entrenched belief systems, which made communities susceptible to collective panic and persecution. At the center of this cultural landscape was the church, which held enormous influence over people's lives, both spiritually and politically. The church's teachings framed witchcraft as not only a crime, but a mortal sin, a direct alliance with the devil. This theological condemnation gave witch hunts a moral urgency that was hard to question. Preachers often used vivid and terrifying imagery in their sermons to warn congregations of the dangers lurking within their own villages. They described witches as traitors to God, who betrayed their neighbors and threatened the very soul of Christian society. These sermons were not merely religious messages, but powerful tools to shape public opinion and justify harsh measures. Moreover, the symbolism surrounding witchcraft, such as the idea of witches flying on broomsticks or holding secret nocturnal gatherings, was deeply embedded in folklore. These stories reinforced fear and created an almost tangible enemy in the minds of ordinary people. This folklore also served to explain the unexplainable: sudden deaths, failed crops, illnesses, and natural disasters. The role of women in these cultural narratives cannot be overstated. Women were expected to conform to narrow roles centered on domesticity and submission. Those who deviated, whether by being outspoken, economically independent, or possessing knowledge of healing, were viewed with suspicion. This misogyny was institutionalized and reinforced by the legal and religious frameworks that sanctioned witch hunts. In fact, the majority of accused witches were women between the ages of 30 and 60, often widowed or unmarried, lacking male protection. Their social vulnerability made them easy targets for accusations. These women were frequently marginalized figures in their communities, and accusations were a means to reinforce social conformity and punish those who challenged it. In fact, the majority of accused witches were women between the ages of 30 and 60, often widowed or unmarried, lacking male protection. Their social vulnerability made them easy targets for accusations. These women were frequently marginalized figures in their communities, and accusations were a means to reinforce social conformity and punish those who challenged it. Interestingly, not all accused were helpless victims. Some were outspoken or had contentious relationships with neighbors. This points to the fact that personal vendettas and local conflicts often played a role in accusations. The witch hunt, therefore, was not only about fear of the supernatural, but also about very real human conflicts played out under the guise of combating evil. Economically, the witch hunts often coincided with times of hardship. Scarcity of resources, crop failures, and poverty created tension within communities. Accusing a neighbor of witchcraft was sometimes a way to remove a competitor or settle disputes over land or inheritance. In some cases, confiscation of the accused's property provided financial incentives for prosecution. The process of accusation itself was fraught with danger. Anyone could be named as a witch, often without substantial evidence. Once accused, the individual's fate was grim. Fear of accusation led many to live in constant anxiety, knowing that a neighbor's jealousy or a child's frightened testimony could condemn them. This atmosphere bred a culture of silence and suspicion. Trust within communities eroded as people feared being implicated or forced to testify against others. Family members were sometimes coerced into betraying their own. The trials themselves were a theater of cruelty. Public trials served as warnings, but also as spectacles, often drawing large crowds. The accused faced hostile judges and prosecutors, and the procedures were designed to break their will. Torture, as already mentioned, was a common tool. The accused were subjected to excruciating pain, sleep deprivation, and humiliation to extract confessions. These confessions, while unreliable and often coerced, were accepted as irrefutable evidence. Execution methods were brutal and designed to send a message. Burning at the stake was symbolic, fire as purification, but it was also excruciatingly painful. Hanging was another common method. These public deaths reinforced the power of authorities and terrorized the population into compliance. Yet, not all regions experienced witch hunts with equal intensity. Geographic, political, and cultural differences influenced the scale and nature of persecutions. For instance, the German-speaking territories saw some of the largest and deadliest witch hunts. The political fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire, combined with religious conflicts during the Reformation, created fertile ground for mass hysteria. Conversely, in southern Europe, particularly Spain and Italy, the Inquisition's approach was somewhat different, with fewer large-scale witch hunts. The Inquisition focused more on heresy, and while witchcraft accusations occurred, the use of torture and execution was less widespread compared to Northern Europe. Understanding these regional differences sheds light on how politics and religious structures shaped the witch hunts. Finally, the decline of witch hunts was not sudden, but gradual. As Europe moved into the Enlightenment, New ideas about science, reason, and justice began to challenge old beliefs. Courts started requiring better evidence and limited the use of torture. Skepticism toward witchcraft accusations grew. Books and intellectual debates questioned the existence of witches or the validity of confessions obtained under duress. These changes helped end the legal persecution of witches. However, the cultural legacy of these hunts, fear, superstition, and misogyny, persisted for centuries. As the flames of the witch hunts finally began to die down by the late 17th and 18th centuries, Europe found itself scarred, not only physically from wars and plagues, but deeply, psychologically and socially, from the brutal persecutions it had witnessed. The aftermath of the witch hunts left lasting marks on societies that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of thousands of innocent lives lost. One of the most profound impacts was the erosion of community trust. During the hunts, neighbors turned on neighbors, families betrayed each other, and suspicion permeated everyday interactions. Even after the trials ended, this deep-seated mistrust did not simply vanish. Many communities found it difficult to rebuild the social fabric that had been torn apart by years of paranoia and fear. One of the most profound impacts was the erosion of community trust. During the hunts, neighbors turned on neighbors, families betrayed each other, and suspicion permeated everyday interactions. Even after the trials ended, this deep-seated mistrust did not simply vanish. Many communities found it difficult to rebuild the social fabric that had been torn apart by years of paranoia and fear. The consequences were especially severe in rural areas, where small villages had been decimated by waves of accusations and executions. With so many members, especially women, gone, villages suffered economically and socially. Women were often the backbone of agricultural and domestic labor. Their loss created labor shortages that affected farming, food production, and family structures. Widows and orphans left behind by the hunts faced particular hardship. Without social support, many struggled to survive. Property confiscations during trials further impoverished families, creating a cycle of poverty and social marginalization that could last generations. The witch hunts also reinforced and intensified gender inequalities. Women, especially those who were vulnerable or outspoken, remained targets of suspicion and discrimination long after the legal persecutions ended. The stereotype of the dangerous woman, linked to notions of witchcraft, continued to shape societal attitudes, influencing how women were viewed and treated in their communities. In some cases, these attitudes contributed to the exclusion of women from certain roles and opportunities, reinforcing patriarchal structures. The cultural trauma of the witch hunts lingered, shaping gender relations well into the modern era. Religiously, the witch hunts prompted both reflection and reform. The brutality and excesses led some church leaders and theologians to reconsider their approaches. While the fear of witchcraft did not disappear overnight, many religious institutions gradually moved away from endorsing violent persecutions. This shift was part of broader transformations during the Enlightenment, where reason, skepticism, and humanism began to challenge earlier dogmas. New theological interpretations emphasized compassion and justice over fear and punishment. These changes helped lay the groundwork for modern attitudes toward justice and human rights. Legally, The witch hunts left a complicated legacy. They exposed the dangers of judicial systems that lacked protections for the accused, relied on torture, and accepted dubious evidence. As Enlightenment ideas spread, many European countries reformed their legal codes, introducing principles such as presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, and prohibitions on torture. These reforms were critical in shaping modern judicial practices, emphasizing fairness and due process. The lessons learned from the witch hunts became warnings against mass hysteria and miscarriages of justice. Culturally, the witch hunts became embedded in folklore, literature, and art, often symbolizing the dangers of fanaticism and intolerance. Over time, the figure of the witch evolved from a feared villain into a subject of fascination and reinterpretation. In the centuries that followed, witches appeared in plays, novels, and eventually films, reflecting changing societal attitudes. Sometimes they were portrayed as evil sorceresses, but increasingly as misunderstood or oppressed figures, symbols of resistance against injustice. In more recent decades, feminist movements have reclaimed the witch as a symbol of female empowerment, challenging the historical narrative that demonized women. The witch hunts, thus, continue to resonate as powerful metaphors for gender oppression and the struggle for autonomy. Finally, the witch hunts serve as enduring lessons about the dangers of fear-driven persecution. Their history reminds us how easily societies can descend into violence when prejudice, superstition, and power intersect. Even today, accusations of witchcraft and related violence persist in parts of the world, underscoring the continued relevance of these lessons. Education, legal protections, and human rights advocacy remain vital tools in combating such abuses. As we close this chapter, it's worth reflecting on the resilience of those who suffered and the importance of remembering their stories. Honoring the victims of the witch hunts helps us build societies grounded in justice, empathy, and reason, ensuring that history's darkest moments are never repeated. As we shift our perspective to the psychological and sociological dimensions of the medieval witch hunts, a disturbing picture emerges, one that goes beyond mere superstition and legal persecution. At its core, the witch hunts were fueled by profound human fears and the social mechanisms that arise in times of crisis. Fear is a primal emotion. It triggers the fight or flight response, pushing individuals and communities to seek safety and certainty in an uncertain world. In medieval Europe, where life was fragile and often brutal, fear was a constant companion. Disease, famine, war, and death surrounded people daily. Against this backdrop, the concept of witches as agents of evil was a way to personify and externalize the fears that otherwise seemed overwhelming and uncontrollable. From a psychological standpoint, the witch hunts can be seen as a collective attempt to impose order on chaos. Labeling certain individuals as witches gave communities a scapegoat, a tangible enemy to blame for misfortune. This served an important function. It unified people through shared fear and hostility, redirecting anxieties away from internal conflicts or systemic problems. Sociologist Emil Durkheim described how societies maintain cohesion through shared beliefs and collective rituals, especially in times of stress. The witch hunts, with their trials and executions, acted as collective rituals, reinforcing social norms and boundaries. They were violent expressions of social cohesion, however tragic and destructive. But these social mechanisms came at a terrible cost. The dynamics of accusation, confession, and execution created a feedback loop of fear and violence. Once the hunts began, they fed on themselves, escalating as more people were accused, tortured, and forced to implicate others. The social fabric unraveled as trust dissolved and suspicion permeated everyday life. Anthropologists have noted that witchcraft accusations often arise in societies experiencing rapid change, conflict, or economic stress. The medieval witch hunts fit this pattern perfectly. As communities faced environmental hardships, religious upheaval, and political instability, the social tensions found expression through witchcraft accusations. The role of gender in these psychological and sociological processes is particularly striking. Women, often marginalized and powerless, became the primary targets. This was not merely coincidence, but reflected deeper anxieties about female agency and social roles. In patriarchal societies, women who stepped outside traditional roles, whether as healers, widows, or outspoken individuals, challenged existing power structures. Branding them as witches was a way to reinforce gender hierarchies and suppress potential threats to male dominance. Moreover, the body of the accused woman became a site of control and fear. Accusations often involved sexualized imagery, pacts with the devil, promiscuity, and perversion, reflecting anxieties about female sexuality and autonomy. The psychological trauma inflicted on accused witches was immense. Torture and public humiliation shattered individuals physically and mentally. The social rejection extended to their families, who faced stigma and isolation. Yet, amidst this darkness, some accused maintained their dignity and faith. Historical records reveal instances of accused witches who, despite torture and condemnation, refused to confess or implicate others. Their courage offers a glimmer of humanity in an otherwise brutal era. From a modern psychological perspective, the witch hunts also illustrate how groupthink and mass hysteria can override individual reason and empathy. Fear amplifies biases, leading to scapegoating and violent outcomes. Understanding these dynamics is crucial. It sheds light on how similar patterns can emerge in different contexts, whether in political purges, moral panics, or social scapegoating today. In closing, viewing the medieval witch hunts through this psychological and sociological lens reveals that the shocking truth is not only about historical events, but about the dark potentials within human societies and minds. It is a call to awareness, urging vigilance against fear-driven injustice in all its forms. As we reflect on the psychological and sociological underpinnings of medieval witch hunts, it becomes clear that the phenomenon was not confined to Europe or the past. The mechanisms of fear, scapegoating, and social control continue to manifest worldwide in various forms, even today. In many societies across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, accusations of witchcraft remain a grim reality. These accusations often arise in communities grappling with poverty, illness, political instability, and social upheaval. Conditions remarkably similar to those in medieval Europe. For example, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Witch hunts have tragically resulted in violence, social ostracism, and even death, particularly targeting elderly women and marginalized groups. Here, as in medieval Europe, witchcraft accusations serve to explain misfortune and enforce social hierarchies. For example, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, witch hunts have tragically resulted in violence, social ostracism, and even death, particularly targeting elderly women and marginalized groups. Here, as in medieval Europe, witchcraft accusations serve to explain misfortune and enforce social hierarchies. The persistence of such beliefs highlights how deeply rooted the human need is to find tangible causes for suffering, and how fear can be manipulated by social and political actors to maintain control. In contemporary societies, while literal witch hunts may be less common, the underlying dynamics are present in other forms. Moral panics, mass hysteria, and targeted persecution of minority groups reflect similar patterns of fear-driven scapegoating. Take, for instance, the McCarthy era in the United States during the 1950s. The intense fear of communism led to widespread accusations, blacklisting, and destruction of careers and lives based on often flimsy evidence. This witch hunt for communists was not about witches at all, but demonstrates how fear can override reason and justice. Understanding the medieval witch hunts thus offers profound lessons about human nature and society. It reveals how fear can be weaponized, how social cohesion can be twisted into violent conformity, and how vulnerable groups, especially women, can become targets. It also shows the critical importance of safeguards, robust legal protections, freedom of thought, education, and a culture that values empathy and critical thinking. Without these, societies risk repeating the mistakes of the past. Furthermore, the cultural legacy of witch hunts has evolved in fascinating ways. The figure of the witch has transformed from a symbol of evil to one of empowerment and resistance. In modern popular culture, witches appear as protagonists and icons in literature, film, and art. They embody themes of independence, rebellion, and alternative spirituality. This reimagining challenges historical narratives and reclaims what was once a tool of oppression. Feminist movements have particularly embraced the witch as a symbol of female strength, resilience, and defiance against patriarchal control. This cultural shift reflects a broader societal reckoning with gender and power. Yet, even as we celebrate this transformation, the shadow of the past remains. The history of witch hunts reminds us that fear and hatred can have devastating consequences. It calls us to remain vigilant against intolerance in all its forms. So as you listen to this story, consider the enduring relevance of its lessons. The witch hunts are not merely a dark chapter in history, but a mirror reflecting challenges that continue to confront humanity. By learning from the past, we equip ourselves to build more just, compassionate, and enlightened societies, where fear does not lead to cruelty, and where every individual is protected and valued. As we deepen our exploration into the lingering effects of witch hunts and their echoes across history and cultures, one striking feature emerges: the way fear manipulates human psychology and shapes societal behavior, often with tragic consequences. Witch hunts thrived on the human tendency to seek simple explanations for complex problems. When faced with famine, disease, or unexplained disasters, people often looked for a scapegoat to channel their fear and frustration. This scapegoating mechanism is deeply rooted in human psychology. It reduces anxiety by identifying an enemy responsible for misfortune. In medieval Europe, the label of witch was assigned disproportionately to women, particularly those on society's margins. These women, often healers, widows, or those who deviated from social norms, became embodiments of societal fears, threats to both religious order and patriarchal control. The witch hunts reinforced existing social hierarchies by controlling those perceived as disruptive or dangerous. Accusations were frequently tools to settle personal scores or to gain property and power. The economic dimension cannot be understated. Property confiscation following convictions impoverished families and enriched accusers or local authorities. Psychologically, the witch hunts reveal the dark side of collective fear. Mass hysteria swept through towns and villages, fueled by rumors, religious fervor, and institutional authority. The social pressure to conform and participate in accusations created an environment where even innocent behaviors could be interpreted as sinister. From a sociological perspective, witch hunts functioned as a means to enforce social cohesion through exclusion and punishment. By identifying and eliminating others, communities reinforced their own identity and norms. Yet this process often led to social fragmentation and trauma. From a sociological perspective, witch hunts functioned as a means to enforce social cohesion through exclusion and punishment. By identifying and eliminating others, communities reinforced their own identity and norms. Yet, this process often led to social fragmentation and trauma. Importantly, the persistence of witchcraft accusations in modern societies, often in communities facing poverty, social instability, or political conflict, demonstrates the universality of these dynamics. Understanding the medieval witch hunts helps us recognize and challenge similar patterns of scapegoating today. Moreover, the cultural legacy of the witch has undergone profound transformation. In the modern imagination, witches are no longer just symbols of evil, but also figures of empowerment and resistance. The feminist reclamation of the witch symbolizes a break from patriarchal oppression and a celebration of female autonomy. Literature, film, and popular culture reflect this shift, portraying witches as complex characters who challenge authority and embrace their power. This evolution in symbolism offers a hopeful counter-narrative to centuries of fear and persecution. Despite this, the history of the witch hunts remains a cautionary tale. It reminds us how fear, prejudice, and the abuse of power can lead to injustice and suffering on a massive scale. As you listen to this story, think about the ways in which fear can distort reality and how critical it is to uphold justice, empathy, and reason. The tragic history of medieval witch hunts is a powerful reminder to guard against such dangers in our own time. One of the most chilling cases in the history of witch hunts is the story of the Pendle witches in early 17th century England. In 1612, 12 people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft in the small Lancashire town of Pendle. The accusations began with a 9-year-old girl named Jeanette Device, whose testimony became central to the trial. Janet's detailed accusations, given under immense pressure, led to the arrest and execution of her own family members and neighbors. The trial itself was swift and brutal. Evidence was circumstantial, often based on hearsay or confessions obtained under duress. Despite this, all 12 were found guilty and executed by hanging. Jeanette, who testified against them, later lived under the heavy shadow of guilt and suspicion. This case highlights how fear, family dynamics, and social tensions intertwined. Personal grudges, economic disputes, and local rivalries fueled accusations, while the legal system offered little protection to the accused. The Pendle trials have since become emblematic of the tragic consequences of mass hysteria and judicial failure. Across the English Channel, the Würzburg witch trials in Germany represent one of the largest and deadliest series of witch persecutions. Between 1626 and 1631, under the rule of Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg, over 900 people were accused and executed. The scale was staggering, including men, women, and even children. One particularly tragic story from Würzburg is that of Merga Bien, a woman accused of witchcraft who was well educated and came from a respected family. Despite her social status, she was arrested, tortured, and ultimately executed. Her case shows that during times of intense hysteria, even social standing could not guarantee safety. The trials were driven by a toxic mix of religious fanaticism, political ambition, and social upheaval. They devastated communities, instilling fear that lingered long after the executions ended. Another poignant example is the case of Agnes Sampson during the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland, 1590. Agnes was a healer and wise woman who was accused of conjuring storms to sink the ship of King James VI. Under torture, she confessed to attending witches' sabbaths and consorting with the devil. Agnes's trial was emblematic of how superstition, politics, and royal paranoia could combine with deadly results. These personal stories illuminate the human cost behind the dry statistics. Each accused was a person with relationships, hopes, and fears, caught in a system that dehumanized and destroyed them. Many accused witches were also known for their healing knowledge or herbal practices, roles which ironically made them targets. In a time before modern medicine, these women were vital to their communities, yet their expertise was feared and misunderstood. The confessions often reveal a disturbing mix of coerced admissions and cultural beliefs. Under torture, accused witches described impossible acts, flying through the night, shape-shifting, and participating in satanic rituals. While these accounts are not credible as historical fact, they reflect the intense pressure and psychological trauma experienced. These stories also show how children were weaponized in witch trials. Young witnesses like Jeanette Device could be manipulated into naming family members or neighbors driven by fear, coercion, or misunderstanding. Reflecting on these specific cases helps us grasp the scale of injustice and the profound human suffering inflicted by witch hunts. It also reminds us how fear can corrupt justice and how important safeguards and empathy are to protect the innocent. It was the year 1612 in Lancashire, England, a cold, harsh place where superstition ran deep and life was tough. The small village of Pendle was about to become the epicenter of one of the most infamous witch trials in history. A story full of fear, betrayal, and tragedy. The saga began with a young girl named Jeanette Device. At only 9 years old, Jeanette was caught in a web of fear and suspicion that would change her life forever. Jeanette's family was poor and tangled in bitter feuds with their neighbors, tensions ripe for accusations in a community on edge. It started when a local man, accused of witchcraft himself, named Elizabeth Device as a witch. The accusation snowballed, spreading like wildfire. Jeanette was pressured by authorities to testify, and despite her youth, her words carried devastating weight. She accused several family members, including her own mother Elizabeth, her grandmother, and her brother. Imagine the turmoil inside Jeanette, torn between fear, loyalty, and the harsh reality of the times. Her testimony was detailed and chilling, describing meetings with the devil, curses cast on neighbors, and mysterious illnesses blamed on witchcraft. Under the intense pressure of the court, Jeanette's words sealed the fate of 12 people, mostly women, but also a few men. The trial itself was a grim affair. The accused were denied fair representation and faced a legal system eager to convict. Evidence was based largely on hearsay, confessions extracted under duress, and the fearful testimonies of children and neighbors. Despite the lack of solid proof, the outcome was brutal and predictable. All 12 were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On August 20th, 1612, they were led to the gallows and executed, a tragic end to a story shaped by fear and hysteria. The impact on the village was profound. Families were shattered, and the community scarred. Jeanette Device herself lived under a cloud of suspicion, her childhood stolen by the horrors of the trial. What makes the Pendle witch trials so powerful is how they expose the dangerous mix of superstition, social tension, and personal vendettas. Accusations were often tools used to settle grudges or seize property, and the legal system offered little protection. The story reminds us how easily fear can escalate into violence, how justice can be perverted by hysteria, and how the innocent can suffer terribly. Reflecting on Pendle is not just about remembering a dark episode in history. It's about recognizing the human cost of intolerance and the importance of protecting truth and fairness in all times. In the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, during the early 17th century, the city of Würzburg became the epicenter of one of the most brutal and expansive witch hunts in European history. Between 1626 and 1631, hundreds of people, men, women, and even children, were accused, tortured, and executed in what would become one of the darkest chapters of the witch hunt era. The roots of this tragic saga lay deep in a society rife with religious conflict, political instability, and social unrest. Europe was engulfed in the devastating 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict that ravaged much of the continent. Würzburg, ruled by Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg, was no exception to this turmoil. Ehrenberg was a zealous Catholic leader, fiercely determined to enforce religious purity and consolidate his power. His obsession with rooting out evil manifested in a terrifying witch hunt campaign that gripped the city and surrounding territories. What started as a few isolated accusations soon exploded into a widespread frenzy, fueled by fear, fanaticism, and political ambition. At the core of the Würzburg trials was the belief that witches were in league with the devil, conspiring to destroy Christian society from within. This narrative, propagated by religious authorities and reinforced by popular superstition, justified extraordinary measures, torture, forced confessions, and mass executions. The accused came from all walks of life. Unlike many witch hunts that disproportionately targeted women, the Würzburg trial saw a significant number of men accused as well. Nobles, clergy, peasants, and even children were caught in the dragnet. The trials blurred social distinctions, demonstrating the extent to which paranoia had spread. The accused came from all walks of life. Unlike many witch hunts that disproportionately targeted women, the Würzburg trials saw a significant number of men accused as well. Nobles, clergy, peasants, and even children were caught in the dragnet. The trials blurred social distinctions, demonstrating the extent to which paranoia had spread. One of the most infamous victims was Merga Bien, a woman of relative wealth and education. Merga was married twice and had several children. Despite her social standing, she was accused of witchcraft, an accusation that shocked many in Würzburg. Her case revealed how no one was truly safe from suspicion. She was arrested, subjected to brutal torture, and eventually executed by burning. The methods of torture employed were horrifying. The accused were subjected to sleep deprivation, starvation, and physical torment. Instruments such as the rack stretched limbs to the breaking point. Fingers were crushed in thumbscrews. The goal was to break the spirit and force confessions of impossible crimes. Confessions often included lurid descriptions of flying to witches' sabbaths, making pacts with the devil, and causing storms, plagues, and deaths. Under unbearable pain, many accused fabricated elaborate stories simply to end their suffering. These confessions then fueled further accusations. Once a person named supposed accomplices, the investigation spiraled out of control, engulfing entire families and communities. It was a self-perpetuating nightmare. The scale of the executions was staggering. Historians estimate that between 600 and 900 people were executed in Würzburg during this period. Public executions served as grim spectacles intended to deter others, but also to demonstrate the absolute power of the prince bishop and the church. The terror didn't stop with death. Families of the accused faced stigma and economic ruin. Property was confiscated and social ties were severed. Communities were left fractured, trust destroyed. The political context of the 30 Years' War cannot be overstated. The chaos and violence of war created an environment where extreme measures were tolerated, even encouraged. The witch hunts served to reinforce control over a fearful population, suppress dissent, and promote religious conformity. Yet, opposition to the madness did emerge. Some clerics and officials began to question the legitimacy of the accusations and the morality of the methods. Slowly, skepticism grew, leading to the eventual end of the hunts. The Würzburg witch trials stand as a terrifying example of how fear, fanaticism, and abuse of power can combine to devastate societies. They reveal the fragility of justice under pressure and the vulnerability of individuals caught in mass hysteria. Reflecting on Würzburg is a sobering reminder of the human capacity for cruelty and the importance of safeguarding rights and reason. To truly understand the horror of the Würzburg witch hunts, we must step inside the mindset and structures that enabled such brutality to unfold on a massive scale. At the top of the hierarchy stood Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg, a man whose authority was both spiritual and secular. As the ruler of the Prince Bishopric of Würzburg, he wielded near absolute power. His reign was marked by a zealous commitment to Catholic counter-Reformation ideals, and he viewed witchcraft not only as a heresy, but as a direct threat to his control and the salvation of his subjects. Ehrenberg's obsession with purging evil was relentless. He personally oversaw investigations and encouraged his officials to root out witches with ruthless efficiency. This climate of fear was compounded by the ongoing chaos of the 30 Years' War, which brought death, displacement, and economic hardship to the region. The mechanisms of persecution. The trials themselves were a terrifying blend of law, superstition, and torture. The legal framework allowed inquisitors to act with wide discretion. Accusations were often based on hearsay, old grudges, or inexplicable misfortunes such as illness or crop failure. Once arrested, suspects faced appalling conditions. Imprisonment was often long and harsh, designed to weaken prisoners physically and mentally. Torture was systematically used to extract confessions. Devices such as the rack twisted limbs painfully, while the strappado, suspending victims by their arms tied behind their backs, caused dislocations and excruciating agony. Sleep deprivation, forced standing for hours, and severe beatings were common. Torture was not merely a means of punishment, but a tool to force the accused to confess to devilish acts, implicate others, and admit to attending Sabbaths where witches were said to worship Satan. These confessions, regardless of their truthfulness, were then used to condemn the accused. The court did not require corroborating evidence. A confession was enough. The Würzburg witch trials stand out as one of the darkest chapters in European history. Imagine yourself living in the early 1600s, in a city gripped by fear and suspicion. Würzburg, a small but important town in the Holy Roman Empire, was ruled by Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg, a man consumed by religious zeal and obsessed with rooting out evil. The backdrop it began with whispers and rumors. An unexplained illness here, a crop failure there, a sudden death in a family. These misfortunes were blamed on witches, individuals believed to have sold their souls to the devil. The church and authorities fueled these fears, preaching that witches were real threats, working to destroy Christian society. Once accused, a person's fate was nearly sealed. The legal system was rigged against the accused. Confess the rack, which stretched limbs until joints threatened to dislocate, was common. The strappado, where victims were hoisted by the arms tied behind their backs, caused excruciating pain and often permanent injury. Sleep deprivation and starvation weakened prisoners, forcing many to confess to crimes. Under this unbearable pressure, accused witches often told one of the most tragic stories is that of Merga Bien. Unlike many acumen were also accused and executed in Würzburg, which families were torn apart as accusations spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once been friends turned into enemies, accusing each other to save themselves. Many who were accused named others under torture, causing the net of suspicion to widen continuously. The scale of the executions was staggering. Estimates suggest that between 600 and 900 people were killed in the Würzburg trials alone. Public executions were designed to terrorize the population, reinforcing the absolute power of the church and the prince-bishop. Yet, opposition grew. Some clergy and officials began to question the legitimacy of the accusations and the morality of the torture. Slowly, skepticism crept in, and the trials ceased. But the scars they left on Würzburg's community were deep and long-lasting. The aftermath saw shattered families, fractured communities, and a population traumatized by the violence and betrayal. Trust between neighbors was broken, and the social fabric was torn. The Würzburg witch trials are a grim reminder of what happens when fear overrides reason, when authority abuses power, and when justice is abandoned. They show how paranoia can consume a society, destroying innocent lives in the process. As you listen, think about the human cost of hysteria, and remember how vital it is to protect justice, empathy, and truth against the forces of fear and oppression. As the hysteria deepened in Würzburg, the atmosphere in the city became suffocating. Imagine walking the narrow streets knowing that suspicion lurked behind every corner. Even the closest neighbors could suddenly turn against you, driven by fear or personal grudges. The boundary between friend and foe blurred, replaced by paranoia. Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg ruled with an iron fist. His belief that witches were destroying his realm wasn't just religious fanaticism, it was political power. The witch trials gave him a tool to consolidate control, silence opposition, and instill fear. The more people were accused and punished, the stronger his grip became. Authorities held mass arrests, rounding up people from villages and towns in the surrounding region. Entire families were swept up in the chaos. The accused were hauled before the court, often without knowing what charges they faced or who had accused them. Their pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. Once imprisoned, their ordeal worsened. The cells were dark, damp, and overcrowded. Many prisoners fell ill from disease and neglect, their health deteriorating rapidly. The psychological torment was as devastating as the physical. Many lost hope entirely. The court sessions were terrifying events. Judges, often officials appointed by Ehrenberg, presided with harshness and zealotry. Torture was officially sanctioned as a means to extract the truth. The accused faced relentless questioning, pain, and humiliation. The testimonies forced from victims were full of dark, fantastical details. They spoke of flying through the night, meeting with the devil in secret forests, and casting deadly curses on neighbors and livestock. While these stories strain credulity, they reflect the intense psychological pressure these people endured. One such victim, Katharina Merklerin, was a midwife and healer. She was respected for her knowledge of herbs and childbirth, yet became a target precisely because of her knowledge. Knowledge feared and misunderstood by others. Accused of using her skills for evil, she was tortured until she confessed. Her death was a profound loss to her community. One such victim, Katharina Merklerin, was a midwife and healer. She was respected for her knowledge of herbs and childbirth, yet became a target precisely because of her knowledge. Knowledge feared and misunderstood by others. Accused of using her skills for evil, she was tortured until she confessed. Her death was a profound loss to her community. The trials spiraled into a self-perpetuating nightmare. Confessions named dozens of others, who were then arrested and subjected to the same horrors. The accusations did not spare children, who were often coerced into giving testimony against adults, including their own parents. As the executions increased, the public spectacle became more gruesome. The accused were led in chains to their deaths, often publicly burned at the stake. These brutal killings served as warnings, meant to terrify the population into submission. Despite the terror, some resisted. A few accused refused to confess, holding on to their innocence to the very end. Their courage, though rare, shone as beacons of humanity amid the darkness. Amid this chaos, the war outside Würzburg's walls raged on. The 30 Years' War devastated much of Germany, bringing famine, disease, and displacement. The desperation of the times fed the paranoia inside the city, fueling the witch hunts. Slowly, voices of reason began to emerge. Some clergy members questioned the validity of confessions gained through torture. Intellectuals and skeptics raised doubts about the entire witch hunt phenomenon. These voices, though initially ignored or suppressed, gradually gained strength. By 1631, the intensity of the witch trials declined. Ehrenberg died in 1631, and his successors took a less severe approach. The legal reforms that followed introduced greater protections for the accused, demanding better evidence and limiting torture. But the damage had been done. Würzburg's population was decimated, social trust shattered. Families were broken, communities traumatized. The legacy of these witch trials serves as a sobering warning. They reveal the destructive power of fear and fanaticism, and how they can override justice and compassion. The story of Würzburg is not merely a tale of the past, but a timeless lesson about the dangers of hysteria and unchecked power. In the modern world, it reminds us to be vigilant against prejudice, scapegoating, and abuses of authority, to protect human rights, to uphold reason, and to foster empathy, so history's darkest chapters never repeat. As you listen, let this story be a call to awareness. The lives lost in Würzburg deserve to be remembered, not as mere victims, but as reminders of our shared humanity and the need for justice. As the frenzy of the Würzburg witch trials continued, the city's atmosphere transformed from one of normalcy into a suffocating grip of terror. Families whispered anxiously behind closed doors. Children learned early to keep their mouths shut and their eyes down, knowing that a careless word could mean death. Even the strongest and most respected figures in the community found themselves caught in a nightmare they could neither escape nor fully comprehend. The Prince Bishop's Court operated almost as an independent state of terror. Accusations flew not just from genuine suspicion, but from envy, greed, and old grudges. A neighbor who coveted a piece of land, a rival who sought to silence dissent, or even a frightened child manipulated by adults could set the wheels of persecution turning. The grim reality was that in Würzburg, the name of witch was a weapon, wielded to destroy reputations and lives. The legal system, instead of protecting its people, became an engine of injustice. Imagine the desperation of those accused. Arrested abruptly, often dragged from their homes, they were imprisoned in cramped, filthy dungeons. Many contracted illnesses that spread rapidly in these confined spaces. The mental toll was unbearable. Isolation, fear of torture, and the impending shadow of execution weighed heavily on every soul. Among those arrested was Katerina Merklerin, a midwife known for her skill and kindness. In a time when medical knowledge was limited, midwives were invaluable. Yet Katerina's expertise made her a target. The authorities feared that her knowledge of herbs and healing was a form of forbidden magic. Under relentless torture, she confessed to witchcraft, though her confession was a product of unbearable pain and fear. Her death was not just the loss of a healer, but the silencing of knowledge and compassion in a fearful society. Similarly, Mergabien's fate highlights the indiscriminate nature of the trials. Merga was a mother and twice widowed woman of some standing. Despite her social status, she was accused, arrested, and tortured. Her story challenges the misconception that only the poor or marginalized were victims. In Würzburg, suspicion could reach anyone. The toll on families was devastating. Husbands lost wives, children lost parents, and entire households were left destitute. Accused witches' properties were often seized by the state or opportunistic neighbors, compounding the tragedy with economic ruin. Children were not spared the horror. Some were used as witnesses, their testimonies extracted through manipulation or fear. Others were accused themselves, punished as harshly as adults. The psychological terror extended far beyond those imprisoned. Survivors and community members lived under a pall of fear. Trust evaporated as neighbors eyed each other warily, unsure who might be the next to disappear. Public executions, often by burning at the stake, were gruesome spectacles. The accused were paraded through the streets, their dignity stripped away, their suffering displayed for all to see. These events served as warnings, tools to maintain order through fear. Yet, in this atmosphere of cruelty, acts of courage emerged. Some accused refused to confess, despite torture. Their steadfastness became symbols of resistance, though tragically, many paid with their lives. As the war raged on outside, the city's elite began to question the madness. Clergy and legal officials grew uneasy with the growing scale of executions and the obvious miscarriages of justice. By 1631, the tide turned. With Ehrenberg's death and increasing skepticism, the trials slowed and eventually ceased. Reforms introduced stricter evidentiary standards and prohibited torture. But Würzburg was forever changed. The trials left scars not only on its population, but on its social and moral fabric. Reflecting on these events, we see how fear, when wielded by those in power, can devastate societies. The Würzburg witch trials are a stark reminder of the importance of justice, due process, and human dignity. The lives lost, the families destroyed, and the communities torn apart demand that we never forget. Their stories teach us to be vigilant against hysteria and prejudice. As you listen to this history, let it deepen your understanding of human vulnerability and the vital need for compassion and reason. Now, let's take a moment to reflect and bring everything together. The story of the Würzburg witch trials, and indeed the entire era of medieval witch hunts, is one of fear, injustice, and human tragedy. It's a story that shakes us because it reveals the worst sides of human nature when fear takes hold and reason is cast aside. For years, communities were torn apart by paranoia. Innocent people, mothers, fathers, neighbors, healers, even children, were dragged from their homes, imprisoned, tortured, and executed, all because they were accused of crimes that did not exist. Crimes born from superstition and hate. We saw how the social, political, and religious powers combined to fuel these horrors. How leaders like Prince Bishop Philippe Adolf von Ehrenberg used the witch hunts to consolidate power and impose control. How ordinary people, caught in a web of fear, suspicion, and survival, turned against each other, sometimes out of desperation, sometimes out of malice. But through all this darkness, there were glimmers of resistance, the bravery of those who refused to confess under torture, the voices of reason that slowly emerged to challenge the madness, and the eventual shift towards justice and enlightenment that ended the persecutions. The legacy of these events still echoes today. They remind us to be vigilant against the dangers of mass hysteria, prejudice, and unchecked authority. They warn us about how easily fear can override empathy and justice. Remember, the victims of the witch hunts were not just numbers or distant memories. They were real people with families, hopes, and dreams, destroyed by cruelty and fear. Honoring their stories means committing ourselves to a world where such tragedies cannot happen again. So as you close your eyes tonight, let the lessons of the past inspire you. Let them remind you of the value of reason, compassion, and courage. Thank you once again for listening. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring history to life. Wishing you a peaceful and restful night. Good night. If you enjoyed our story tonight, please hit that like button. It really means a lot to us. We pour so much effort into bringing these stories to you as a team, carefully researching and crafting each narrative to make history come alive for you. We'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below and let us know what kind of story you'd like to hear next. Whether it's a chilling historical event, an unsolved mystery, or a fascinating biography, share your ideas with us. We want to create videos that you're excited about. Your feedback guides us, and in our next video, we'll explore the story you choose. Together, let's continue this journey through the depths of history, uncovering the truths that shaped our world. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for supporting our channel. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story. Until next time, take care and have a peaceful night.